Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. At 3:17 in the morning, inside a fortified cabin hidden deep in the mountains of Jalisco, the most powerful drug lord in Mexico was running out of hallway. Outside, rotor blades cut through the cold air as gunfire echoed against pine-covered ridgelines. Inside, reinforced doors splintered under suppressing fire. The ghost who had ruled for years was cornered. For nearly a decade, he had existed as something more rumor than man. Intelligence agencies tracked fragments of his empire, but rarely glimpsed the architect himself. Rival cartels feared his reach. Entire regions shifted under the weight of his organization. Yet he avoided spectacle, never granting interviews, never posing for cameras, never chasing fame. He commanded what many described as a $20 billion machine. His cartel operated less like a loose criminal syndicate and more like a disciplined paramilitary force. Armored convoys, rocket launchers, encrypted communications, global drug routes extending far beyond North America. But scale was not his greatest strength. Discipline was. Unlike the kingpins before him, he studied their mistakes. Visibility had undone them. Ego had exposed them. Predictability had betrayed them. So he removed himself from the spotlight and built layers between himself and the world. Trusted couriers, compartmentalized cells, shifting safe houses, controlled violence calibrated to avoid overwhelming international retaliation. For years, that strategy worked. He remained elusive, expanding quietly while others collapsed under pressure. But invisibility is not magic. It is management. And management leaves patterns. Patterns in movement. Patterns in trust, patterns in who is allowed close. You don't capture a ghost by chasing the shadow. You wait. You follow the pattern. And eventually, the pattern leads you to a door. Long before armored convoys and encrypted radios, there was a young man crossing north with little more than necessity in his pocket. In the 1980s, Nemesio Oseguera Cervantes worked the marijuana fields of California. Anonymous, undocumented, replaceable. The days were long, the pay uncertain, and the future fragile. No one in those fields would have predicted that one laborer among thousands would one day command an empire measured in billions. His first real education in the drug economy did not come from power. It came from proximity. He saw how product moved, how middlemen negotiated, how risk and reward were calculated at every level. The system was not chaotic. It was structured. When he was arrested on drug-related charges and sentenced in the United States, he entered another kind of institution, one that revealed how law enforcement built cases, how investigations unfolded, how mistakes were punished. At age 30, he was deported back to Mexico. For some, deportation ends ambition. For him, it clarified it. He returned not as a defeated migrant, but as a man who had observed both sides of the narcotics pipeline. He understood demand. He understood enforcement, and most importantly, he understood that survival required discipline. Back in Mexico, he joined the Millennial Cartel in Michoacán, not as a flamboyant rising star, but as a quiet enforcer. Those who worked with him later described a calculating temperament, a preference for structure over chaos. He did not speak more than necessary. He watched. He measured. He learned where loyalty fractured and where opportunity hid inside instability. When internal conflicts began tearing the organization apart, many reacted with visible aggression. He reacted with patience. Fragmentation to him was not disaster. It was a vacuum, and vacuums invite architects. The man who would one day be hunted in the mountains first learned to build in silence. When the Millennial Cartel fractured under internal pressure and external enforcement, most factions scrambled to defend shrinking territory. He did something different. From the splinters, he began constructing a new organization, one not bound by old loyalties or outdated routes. It would become known as the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG, and unlike the cartels before it, this one would be built for speed. The timing was precise. As federal forces intensified operations against older power centers, especially after the capture of Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, entire trafficking corridors destabilized. Violence surged as rivals fought for control. While others bled resources in open war, he pivoted towards something more scalable, synthetic drugs. Methamphetamine laboratories expanded rapidly, and fentanyl production offered staggering margins with minimal agricultural footprint. Synthetic narcotics changed the equation. No vast fields to monitor, no seasonal harvest cycles. Production could be hidden in warehouses, industrial buildings, remote compounds. Distribution could be rerouted dynamically. Profits multiplied faster than traditional models ever allowed. Intelligence assessments would later estimate that his empire generated billions annually, numbers rivaling and perhaps exceeding earlier cartels at their peak. But expansion alone does not guarantee durability. He imposed structure. Cells were compartmentalized, command chains clarified, salaries and equipment standardized. CJNG's rapid rise was not fueled purely by brutality, though brutality was used strategically, but by organization. Discipline became culture. He also avoided unnecessary provocation in the United States. While his products flowed north and overseas, he minimized direct theatrical violence against American civilians. That restraint reduced immediate political escalation from Washington, buying time. And time in the criminal underworld is capital. Within a few short years, CJNG had transformed from a splinter faction into one of the most formidable organizations in the hemisphere. But every empire carries an invisible flaw. The faster it grows, the more trust it must distribute. And trust, once traced, becomes a map. By the mid-2000s, CJNG no longer resembled a traditional trafficking network. It projected power like a standing force. Convoys of armored trucks rolled through contested towns, steel-plated exteriors welded by hand, mounted machine guns fixed to improvised turrets. Fighters appeared in coordinated formations, faces covered, weapons raised in choreographed displays meant to signal dominance rather than conceal it. Their arsenal reflected ambition. Beyond standard assault rifles, authorities documented .50 caliber weapons capable of piercing vehicles, grenade launchers, and rocket-propelled systems designed to threaten aircraft. This was not symbolic militarization. It was practical preparation for confrontation. The message was clear. If the state came, it would be met with force. Territory under their influence functioned differently. Checkpoints materialized along rural highways. Surveillance lookouts reported unfamiliar vehicles. In certain regions of western Mexico, CJNG enforced rules, settled disputes, and extracted informal taxation from illicit economies. The organization blurred the line between criminal syndicate and insurgent structure. This transformation reshaped the government's calculus. An arrest operation was no longer a simple warrant served at dawn. It required battlefield planning, layered intelligence, coordinated units, aerial awareness. Any attempt to capture its leader would provoke resistance designed not merely to delay, but to punish. At the center of that machine remained a man who believed in deterrence through perception. If the world saw his forces as invincible, fewer would challenge them. If rivals believed confrontation meant annihilation, fewer would risk it. For years, that strategy worked. But perception, like loyalty, depends on stability. And stability begins to fracture when pressure is applied quietly, from within. For all his discipline, the architecture of secrecy depended on something fragile: human consistency. Phones were rotated, routes were varied, messages were relayed through layers. Yet intelligence agencies understood that even the most cautious networks develop rhythm over time, and rhythm, once measured, becomes traceable. The breakthrough did not come from a dramatic betrayal broadcast across headlines. It emerged slowly through signals analysis, intercepted fragments, and financial irregularities that hinted at deeper access. At one point, authorities gained insight into sensitive communications that suggested his inner circle was not as insulated as he believed. Whether through technical compromise or quiet infiltration, the implication was unsettling. The perimeter was no longer impenetrable. Cooperation between Mexican forces and U.S. intelligence tightened discreetly. Analysts revisited a familiar doctrine from past high-profile manhunts. Do not pursue the king directly. Track the trusted intermediary. Leaders shield themselves behind layers, but those layers must move, and movement creates opportunity. Attention narrowed toward a particular associate whose responsibilities seemed routine but intimate, transporting one of his romantic partners between safe locations. It was a task assigned only to someone deeply trusted. The logic was simple. Personal relationships require proximity, and proximity weakens invisibility. Surveillance units shifted from pursuit to patience. The courier was monitored around the clock, license plates recorded, refueling stops documented, communications mapped. There would be no premature move. If this thread truly connected to the center, it would eventually reveal the pattern. And once revealed, it would lead somewhere physical, somewhere finite. Weeks passed without spectacle. The courier drove ordinary vehicles, stopped at unremarkable gas stations, blended into the rhythm of provincial highways. Surveillance teams rotated shifts, documenting every deviation, every pause longer than necessary. Nothing about the movement screamed urgency, and that was precisely why it mattered. Eventually, the route shifted westward into the highlands of Jalisco. The roads narrowed, curving through pine forests and rising into cooler air. Cellular signals thinned, traffic diminished. The associate escorted the woman toward a region known more for scenic cabins and weekend retreats than firefights. Tapalpa, a mountain municipality tucked into rugged terrain. When the vehicle turned off the main road toward a secluded compound, observers did not intervene. They confirmed entry. They watched from a distance, logging security rotations and perimeter activity. The structure appeared modest from afar, but the surrounding terrain favored defense. Limited approach routes, elevation advantage, natural concealment beneath dense canopy. Hours later, the girlfriend departed the property under escort. That detail was decisive. If she had left and he remained, then the compound likely still housed its primary occupant. Analysts cross-referenced intercepted chatter, drone feeds, and satellite imagery. Confidence grew. The pattern had narrowed to a place. Military commanders resisted the temptation to strike immediately. Certainty required patience. Units were staged quietly along ridge lines through the night, communication restricted to essential channels. The objective was not merely to confront, it was to prevent escape. In the mountains above Tapalpa, the perimeter was slowly closing. From a distance, the compound resembled a private retreat. Timber structures set against sloping hills, framed by pine trees and cool mountain air. But closer inspection revealed design with intent. Entry points were limited, sight lines were controlled. Vehicles were positioned not casually, but strategically, angled for rapid deployment or defensive response. It was less a vacation home than a layered shield. Outer guards rotated in disciplined intervals. Lookouts monitored access roads that twisted through the terrain like natural choke points. The geography itself functioned as reinforcement. Steep gradients slowed approach, tree cover obscured aerial visibility, and narrow passages could be sealed quickly. Anyone attempting to storm the property without preparation would face immediate resistance. Inside the perimeter, intelligence suggested multiple defensive rings. The inner circle was believed to remain near the main residence at all times, forming a living barrier around their leader. Reinforced doors, secured corridors, fallback positions, architecture shaped by anticipation of conflict. He had not chosen Tapalpa for comfort alone. He had chosen it for control. Mexican military planners studied the site carefully. A daylight assault risked exposure and potential civilian presence in nearby areas. A rushed breach could trigger escape protocols hidden within the compound. The decision was made to strike before dawn, when darkness concealed movement and reaction time dulled. Throughout the night of February 21st, units quietly took position along the surrounding ridgelines. Helicopters remained staged at a distance, engines silent until needed. Radios carried only essential commands. The circle tightened gradually, deliberately. In the stillness before sunrise, the fortress appeared calm, but the mountains were no longer empty. Shortly before dawn on February 22, 2026, the stillness broke. Special Forces units advanced under cover of darkness, sealing off approach roads before the first shot echoed through the trees. Then the perimeter ignited. Muzzle flashes lit the compound as guards responded instantly, unleashing heavy fire into the blackened slopes. This was no disorganized panic. The defenders were prepared. High-caliber weapons thundered from fortified positions, and armored vehicles roared to life inside the grounds. Rocket-propelled grenades streaked upward, their blasts aimed at deterring aircraft from closing distance. The mountains amplified every explosion, turning the firefight into a rolling echo of violence. Mexican special forces pushed forward methodically despite the barrage. Suppressive fire pinned outer guards while breaching teams advanced toward entry points. The courtyard became a chaotic convergence of smoke, shattered masonry, and shouted commands over encrypted radios. 4 cartel gunmen forming the inner security layer fell in the opening exchange, but resistance held. 3 soldiers were seriously wounded as they pressed through concentrated fire. Still, the assault did not falter. This was not an operation designed for negotiation. It was a calculated strike intended to collapse the defensive rings before escape routes could activate. Every minute mattered. As outer resistance weakened, the battle shifted inward toward the main structure. The firefight narrowed from open grounds to corridors and reinforced doors. Somewhere beyond those walls, the man who had built an empire on patience and control was confronting something he had long avoided: direct confrontation. And the corridor leading to him was growing shorter. Inside the main residence, the architecture tightened. Hallways narrowed, sightlines shortened, doors reinforced to slow intrusion. Tactical briefings later identified the West Wing as the likely fallback position, a fortified corridor designed to protect the primary target or provide access to a concealed escape route. It was the final defensive pocket within the compound. Special forces advanced in disciplined formation, clearing rooms under sustained suppressive fire. Standard issue 5.56mm rifles cracked in controlled bursts, rounds tearing through drywall and splintering wooden frames. Smoke gathered near the ceiling, debris scattered across tile floors. Guards fired from prepared angles, attempting to stall the push long enough for their leader to reposition. But time was collapsing. Caught within what soldiers call a fatal funnel, the narrow space where movement becomes predictable and exposure unavoidable, he attempted to withdraw deeper into the wing. The walls that once symbolized protection now confined him. Suppressive fire intensified. High-velocity rounds penetrated reinforced doors and fragmented cover. In the chaos of crossfire, he was struck multiple times in the torso. He fell in the corridor that had been engineered to shield him. Around him, the remaining members of his inner security detail were neutralized as the firefight reached its end. Years of calculated invisibility had narrowed to a single physical space, and that space offered no escape. When the gunfire finally ceased, the most elusive figure in Mexico's criminal landscape lay critically wounded inside his own stronghold. The ghost who had managed patterns, territories, and fortunes was reduced to a moment measured in seconds. The fortress had held until it didn't. By mid-morning, Mexico was burning. Highways were blocked by flaming trucks dragged sideways across asphalt. Thick columns of smoke rose over Guadalajara as gunmen torched gas stations and exchanged fire with security forces in broad daylight. In coastal resorts near Puerto Vallarta, stunned tourists watched armored convoys race past palm-lined streets, their vacations collapsing into sirens and confusion. The retaliation spread fast: Michoacán, Guanajuato, Zacatecas. Vehicles hijacked, roads sealed, intersections turned into barricades of twisted metal. It was not spontaneous chaos. It was choreography. A message written in fire. The machine still moved. The state had struck the head. The body reacted. But as the day stretched on, the violence began to fragment. Roadblocks were cleared, smoke thinned, sirens faded into distance. And far from the highways, the mountains of Tapalpa returned to silence. Pine trees stood unmoved. Morning light filtered across ridgelines as if nothing had happened. The compound remained scarred: shattered windows, splintered doors, spent casings scattered across tile floors. Inside the West Wing, the hallway was still. That corridor had been designed as protection. Reinforced doors, narrow angles, calculated defense. For years, its architect believed he could manage every variable: loyalty, routes, markets, risk. He had built layers between himself and the world, but patterns collapse into places. Places collapse into moments, and moments collapse into seconds. At 3:17 in the morning, the ghost ran out of hallway. Outside, a country reeled in fire and smoke. Inside, an empire narrowed to silence.